So, Bev, we're talking about five political prisoners who are dual American Iranian nationals. They include an oil executive named Ziamak Namazi. They include a businessman named Emek Shargi. They include an environmentalist named Morad Tabaz, who have been held for years. They are being swapped for $6 billion of assets, Iranian assets that have been frozen in South Korea for years, and five Iranians who face charges in the United States, four for sanctions evasion, one for being the agent of a foreign country. They are being released. Now, interestingly, only two of those Iranians are expected to come back to Iran. Two are choosing to stay in the United States from reports that we have. One is going to a third country. That will be a bit of an embarrassment for the Iranians who wanted to parade their citizens coming back in exchange for the Americans who are finally being released.
Yeah, that is really interesting. This 6 billion US dollars that's also tied into this money that had been held in South Korea. Do we know, are there conditions on that money flowing to Iran?
Absolutely. Now, when this deal was announced several weeks ago, uh, the conditions that were stated is that they have to use those funds for humanitarian purposes, such as food and medicine, and that the money is going to be overseen by Qatari authorities. Now, some Iranians tried to dispute that, said, no, 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 we'll control the funds. But others said, well, no, we don't. Even, however, if this money is earmarked for food and medicine, some people are saying, well, what that does is that releases funds inside Iran that might be used for food and medicine for other purposes, including possibly for the military. Uh, I think we have to wait and see what the impact of the money is, but I'll give you the bottom line on this, Bev. This deal was made primarily by the Iranians, not, I think, at this point to move towards a nuclear deal, but because the economy is in very desperate circumstances and they need the cash,
Yeah,
point
they
blank.
desperately. So your sense is that it is not linked to progress on those nuclear deterrence talks?
But I think if we were talking about this sort of in isolation, you might see this as a confidence building measure because these talks have been stalled for renewing the nuclear deal. They've been stalled since early 2022. But there's been a major development in the past week which cuts against that. And that is the International Atomic Energy Agency has called out the Iranians and said, look, you are not cooperating with us. Indeed, the IAEA said last weekend there is an unprecedented block on inspectors. The Iranians have effectively said that one-third of the inspection team, that's it. We're not recognizing them. So until the Iranians come back in to negotiating the terms under which their nuclear facilities can be inspected to make sure they're not being used for military purposes, I think we're going to have a significant stalemate. And I'll put it to you, Bev, I think we've got two Irans that are in play here. I think we've got one Iran, which is the foreign ministry, which talks about a deal might occur. And then we have one Iran, which is that of the Revolutionary Guards and the Supreme Leader's office, that are very hesitant, still very hesitant about any discussions with the Americans.
Yeah, interesting. You know, it's interesting, Scott, that a day after many were out on the streets yesterday, remembering the death of Mahsa Amini that sparked long protests in Iran. Today we're talking about this deal. Human rights were never on the table in these discussions?
Well, except for the human rights for those five American Iranians who had their rights deprived for years.
Yeah.
But the wider rights of Iranians, no. And in fact, again, without proof, but my suspicion is that the Iranian foreign ministry is playing up and had been playing up the idea of this exchange of prisoners precisely to try to deflect attention from the anniversary of Mahsa Amini's death, the woman who was reportedly beaten, died in police custody because of inappropriate attire. And those protests go on. As much as you'll have Iranian representatives will say today, it's all done, there's no more protest. There were people who, despite the possibility of arrest, despite the possibility of being shot, were out on the streets this weekend. So there is still fire under the ashes that the Iranian regime has been ruthless in suppressing these protests, but they cannot stop them completely.
Yeah. Good to get you and your analysis on the show today. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Bev.